Turtles all the way down. I'm Jake, sometimes Cenk. I just got back recently from Italy. I was there for much of this past summer in southern Italy. I did get to see Rome and Napoli. Was in the Amalfi Coast for a while, but most of the time I spent on farms, like agroturismo type situations, kind of in nature for most of the time, and close to a small town as well. So got a feel for that strange and delightful form of life. While I was over there, I got to admit, I started feeling a little bit lonely. I was traveling alone for most of it. I was by myself, and I started feeling lonely. And someone recommended that I try Tinder. And I had tried it before, and when it first came out a few years back, and it seemed kind of a weird, Wild West kind of a thing that didn't seem to suit me at the time. I tried it in Italy, I downloaded it, and I found beautiful Italian women there, but didn't really have the guts to meet anybody. But it was kind of eye-opening to go through and use this app. It's kind of like... It's addictive, like apps of other kinds and games like Tetris, or it's like Candy Crush with TNA. And when I came back to Canada, I kept the app going. So I've been going through that, and actually I've met a couple of people on there, which is kind of surprising for me to do so. But so far so good. Nice, friendly people. But it's funny that when you go on one of those sites, you have to kind of explain yourself or pitch yourself or describe yourself in kind of a short, sometimes very short. Sometimes the people are actually just putting on one picture. Sometimes it's just pictures without any description. What did they do? They put on, like dimensions, the size and shape and colors and ratios and that sort of thing. Or they put on stats to do with their mind cycles, like their capacities, what they are capable of doing. And those are often indicated by badges of honor that they may have achieved through school, like degrees and that sort of thing. So they might describe that as a way to an understanding of what that person is all about. Or they might talk about their cultural influences and experiences and their tendencies, or what they like or what they don't like, or what they like to intake and output and that sort of thing. And what we're all doing here is kind of an impossible task, but of course it's kind of a narrowed, limited window onto yourself. And when you're out traveling for the summer like I was, and I'm kind of reminded of this thing that I used to hear more in the past than I do these days, this notion of traveling to find yourself. There was this idea that that you travel the world to find yourself. And that was kind of a romantic notion that I would hear growing up as kind of a, what you do when you grow up. You go to school, then you go around the world and then you find yourself. But then you hear about these other people that are traveling, and especially with these maybe the ones that are drawn to these Eastern mystical traditions, they talk about losing themselves, or moving towards a kind of a dissolution of the self. And I got to say, I'm kind of engaged in both of these things at once. I mean, these projects are always kind of ongoing in my life. I have spent a lot of time thinking about, who am I? What am I? And increasingly, I'm getting to realize that the questions are should be more about how am I? Because it's to me, it seems like we are not a thing, definitely not a static thing. It's more like a process. It's more like a movement. It's more like a dance, or more like a storm or a cyclone, as I've described it. It's kind of like this. I think of myself and the self as kind of a collection of all of these cycles of information that are moving around. Some of them are physical, of the body. Some of them are just ideas that are transmitted as information, as between different parts of the body, or between me right now talking and sending some information to you through words. Some of it is built into our cultural frameworks of cultural practices. We're made up of kind of a haze that seems to be more or less centered around this body that we associate, with Cenk, the system here that is talking to you right now is kind of this, this cloud that just kind of moves around. And I think we're all kind of like this. And it's kind of fascinating that, like on a dating site, you've got these two nebulous systems that, first of all, are trying to describe each other in a very kind of a narrow pinhole view of what that person is. But it's shocking how much information we get across, and it's shocking, how quickly we can, like I said, it's kind of like a video game app. You find yourself going through quickly, swiping left and right. And it's kind of interesting to see once you get going quickly to do this, it becomes an automatic process, and it's kind of interesting to see what you automatically find yourself swiping left or right for. Yeah, so, we describe ourselves in these, whether it's by the body, with the dimensions of the body, or with the mind, its capacities and its attainments, its cultural expressions and preferences, that sort of thing. These are all kind of like, pointing to the fact that we are made up of a bunch of things swirling around inside us. So, when you say find yourself or lose yourself, which one, which one of yourselves are you hoping to find or lose? To me, it's like we have a collection of these proto-beings within us. And when you're kind of engaged in a practice of improving yourself or changing yourself or finding yourself or losing yourself or anything, it seems to me that what you're doing is you're actually trying to give more power and prominence to some other aspect of you and less to another aspect of you. And that essentially happens by, repetition, iteration. We have practices, we have rituals that, cause us to repeat these cycles over and over again. And once we repeat something a sufficient number of times, it begins to take on a being of its own. Its reality becomes stronger. It becomes something that we can point to. And, these cycles are very much embedded in our body through our ancestors, for example. I mean, our DNA is kind of like this coding of what our ancestors were like and what their experiences were like. It's encoded directly into the body that is in play when I'm being formed and continue to be in play as I'm being formed now, because we know, epigenetically that these genes aren't just something that you either have or you don't. Some of them are dependent upon, their expressions and what triggers them and what expresses them and what doesn't. So as a result of that, you have a much more wider ranging, possibilities in terms of what can result from the encoding that you find in the body of a DNA. With those you have, so the ancestors are in us in a sense, they're swirling around in there, maybe faint and muted, but something that your grandfather or some way that your grandmother was or did or experienced is impacting you right now in some sense. So that's part of you. That's kind of swirling around inside you. Now, so we've got those ancestors. Then we've also got what I call characters. And these are other beings that we come into contact with that are kind of swirling around inside us, but they're not embedded necessarily within our body. And those characters could be people that you come into contact with, whether they're, in your world, or maybe historical or fictional characters as well. Now, someone like, Friedrich Nietzsche, who was probably a major influence on me, is in there somewhere. It's swirling around. And it is just a character in the sense that I never met Nietzsche. I never talked to him in the same room. We don't have that kind of bandwidth connection. But there is a great deal of probably asynchronous in this sense, because I know a lot about him. He knows nothing about me. But his cycles are kind of swirling around inside me. But my father, on the other hand, is kind of both, isn't he? He's kind of like my ancestor and he's a character. I mean, because he's got these body systems that have affected me. And it's at play all the time. But because I've also been in contact with him over the years, he's kind of functioned as kind of a character cycle as well. And that's also imprinted itself within me. And it's kind of swirling around. And, it's funny because when I used to I read a lot of Nietzsche, when I was like 19, 20 years old. And I got so deeply into it that I almost felt like I was running a simulation of him inside me. It's like when somebody would be talking and thinking, well, what would Nietzsche, I wonder, would say about that? I almost felt like I knew. It was like I had a simulation inside me, and I would just say, okay, run simulation, and then Nietzsche would spit out what that response would have been. Because it seemed like it was such a detailed version of this being that I was, it was a character. I was kind of imagining it as I was reading it. And so much so that, I can basically mimic, in some cases when I was, especially when I was deep into it in those days. Same thing with my father or mother. I mean, you find yourself sometimes... I find myself sometimes doing some kind of an expression or movement that my father would always do. And then, but what is that? It's both, right? It's kind of like a ancestral body kind of a similarity that causes me to be like that. But there's also character, experiential kind of coming into contact with that person also has embedded those movements in some sense so that it repeats. It comes out in me. It expresses itself, just like... Nietzsche's ideas expresses itself through me. If I read enough of it, I kind of feel like I have a reasonable facsimile of a simulation of Nietzsche running within me, or a reasonable facsimile of a simulation of my father running within me, so that I could probably guess what he's going to do or how he's going to react. And it's kind of a similar thing. Our consciousness, our brains, our minds, whatever you want to call it, our systems here. We create these simulations that run within us concurrently with all the other systems that are running in there, and they're all kind of at play. And depending on what's all going in there, the system expresses certain things. Right now, I'm talking to you, and I've got all of these things spinning around inside me. I mean, I got all these body systems, these memories, my historical. I'm thinking about family, about Nietzsche, about. I got this paper book in front of me. All of these, the body systems of my back. There's hunger involved. All these things are kind of playing out together. In all of these storms and cyclones that are sharing parts. What do I mean by that? So I think of all of these cycles within us as kind of abstract information loops. I'm not necessarily talking about these things are actual physical loops. In some cases they are, like the blood circulation system is very much a loop physically. But they're information loops. They're kind of, repeated patterns of movement and processes over time that become regularized and become entrenched within our physical systems, within our DNA. And most of these systems are kind of like mixed. I mean, they're of the body, and they're also of the mind. So when I say that sometimes parts of these cycles are shared by different cycles, you think of, remember that movie Twister, where you had that famous scene that was also in the trailer that everybody remembers of basically this giant storm, and you've got this cow. It's kind of caught up, poor mammal, caught up inside this swirling cyclone, and it's kind of spinning around. Now imagine if there was several other cyclones around, and this cow was kind of being spun around and then sucked into another cyclone and then back into that cyclone and back. So it's kind of like parts of it are functioning in different systems. It's probably getting too complicated. I'll have to find a better way to describe this. But what I'm trying to say is that it's a mishmash of all of these storms and systems, and they're not separated completely. They're kind of within each other as well. They're kind of like Venn diagrams overlaid with each other, but they're moving informationally. So you've got body systems, you've got mind systems, and you've got, so your ancestors are kind of floating around within you in some sense. The characters that you've come into contact with are floating around within you and impacting your behavior in some sense, be it they be family, friends, teachers, people you've known throughout the world, or historical and fictional figures, like Jerry Lewis just died recently. And when my friend said, hey, Jerry Lewis died, the first thing that I did that popped out of me was kind of involuntarily, I went, lady, it's like, all of a sudden I was kind of taken over by the cyclone of Jerry Lewis, who was kind of in there somewhere spinning around and momentarily took over my body. I mean, yeah, we're speaking metaphorically, but yeah, in some sense, that's actually true. That cycle of information, briefly for a second, took over, and I projected and behaved in that way. So this is what's going on all the time. You're kind of like all of these swirls, but there's kind of an interesting category of these storms, and I don't know what to call these, but so you got, like the ancestors that are connected by body, you've got characters that are connected by experience and interaction. I don't know, there's a third category, maybe we call them daemons or sui generis. I mean, these are kind of created within you whole cloth. I mean, these are cyclones that are running within you that you haven't, they're not an ancestor. They're not a character that you've come into contact with, historical or fictional, in the world, but there's something that you're creating based on all of those other cyclones, be they body, interactive, family, historical, famous people, parents, siblings, Jerry Lewis, Nietzsche, what have you. You've got bits and pieces of everything and all of these experiences. And what you can do is you basically can create these other, I don't know, in some cases, they're alter egos. Some cases, they're versions of you that are kind of a recipe of cycles within you that, that present themselves in a different ratios. And then all of a sudden, you've got Jake, who's kind of like business Jake, and, who can negotiate contracts and make real estate deals and, do film production deals, that sort of thing. And, change the settings and dial it differently. And all of a sudden, boom, you can create a different version of me, the academic Jake, who's, sitting in and talking about, philosophy of science or quantum mechanics with PhDs in physics. And, that's a different me. There's also the nerd me, there's the artist me, there's the fantasy versions of us. I mean, you might even, maybe you think you're Batman, or you imagine that you are, or there's even what I think of as kind of like aspirational alter egos. These are like you create an image of yourself in your mind of what you'd like to be. Maybe. And this kind of swirls around within you so much that eventually it starts to impact your behavior, because that is starting to have an impact on how you behave, because it's in there in the mix. And then eventually what you're hoping, I guess, by putting that alter ego in there is that starts to influence all the rest of it and start to take over and take more prominence, and you eventually become that person. And in a strange sort of way, that's kind of what you're doing when you're kind of imagining a future that you want for yourself. In a sense, you're kind of imagining yourself as a different version of you, but that version kind of gets a head start within you, starts spinning around and impacting your behaviors. And, the hope is that it starts to take over. And so... online dating and the self. I guess, in some sort of way, I was doing my PhD in philosophy years ago, and I never really could get started on the thesis. I didn't really know what I really wanted to say or research or study or prove or find or dig deep into, because whatever it was, next week, I changed my mind, and it became, something that Nietzsche was writing about, something that Heidegger was writing about, something about quantum mechanics, something about cosmology, or what have you. But they all kind of relate to, they're all kind of touching on a couple of things here and there. And one of the things that I keep coming back to is this notion of the self. And I've been thinking a lot about this lately, it seems. And instead of writing a book about it, which is might be difficult to do, because it's not the kind of thinking that I'm trying to maybe present or use in this case, implement, is not the kind that can easily be written out into line items and or into an argument. It's better displayed as a conversation, I think. And I'm hoping to do this in such a way that if you listen to any one of these monologues, you're probably not going to get a full understanding of it. But I bet you if you listen to a bunch of them in a row, you're going to start to see maybe, and hopefully, if I've done something right, you start not just to see what I'm saying, but to see it in the way that I'm seeing it, which to me almost seems like an extra dimensional way of thinking about it. And I mean, maybe it always seems that way when it's kind of a new framework, as I said. What I'm hoping to present here is a way of looking at this is not the only way or the right way. What I'm saying is this is an interesting way to think about the self that is very explanatory and could be very useful to understand a lot of other things, be it psychology, physiology, whether it's history, culture. All of these things can relate to basically the idea that it's a collection of systems that are at play with, against, and together, to create this net effect, which is the self. And what that does, of course, is kind of play a number on you when it comes to this notion of, well, if that's all true, then, you could ask questions about, for example, free will, which might actually make a good subject matter for the next monologue. Well, see you next time. Talk soon.